life really is an improvisational art. And so, what allows us to be resilient is to be flexible. And to be flexible or improvisational requires us to draw upon the multiple inner aspects of ourselves and apply them to our circumstances.
Hi, Andrew. I'm super excited to have you on Staying Ageless today. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.
I'm delighted to be with you, Asosa. Hi.
So, first of all, I'm just super fascinated by your endeavor to interview 500,000 people. I love interviewing people. This is part of why I do this. I just like learning about, patterns. You're a clinical psychologist. Before we get into like your whole mission and interviewing people and learning about life stages, can you tell us how you got into clinical psychology?
Yeah, I started out my career in psychiatric crisis teams. So I was on bridges and in siege situations or in really highly conflictual situations where people were often contemplating abbreviating their lives. And I was very fortunate that nobody ever did. But it got me fascinated in how you stop people getting to that point in their lives. And then since that time, 35 years ago, I've been doing a lot of research in all sorts of areas in thinking about that and how you construct a different way of being really in your life and how you create a resilient life as well.
Yeah, that's really good. Why resilient? Why do you say resilient?
Well, I guess I defined resilience as the happy knack of being able to bungee jump through the pitfalls of life. So when tough stuff happens to you, as it happens to us all, how you rise above it, how you get past the obstacles of life, and to think about how you do that, obviously, is a critical skill. Now, as far as I understand it, life really is an improvisational art. And so what allows us to be resilient is to be flexible. And to be flexible or improvisational requires us to draw upon the multiple inner aspects of ourselves and apply them to our circumstances. And those circumstances, of course, vary at different stages of our life and different times. And so it's an important thing just to think about how we can increase flexibility. So as a general
I
kind of
like
rule,
that.
well,
I like
yeah,
the
yeah.
flexibility.
Yeah, and the idea that
Yeah,
it's an
no, I love that
improvisational
because
art.
I always tell people that, yes, I always tell people that the true measure of health is resilience because really, if you're super healthy, you should be able to bounce back whenever, hopefully, whenever any sort of crisis or health issue comes and you build that resilience over time through doing all your healthy rituals. So I like it from your perspective because the flexibility portion is very interesting because that also means, if I'm in a new environment, I'm flexible, I'm able to like find the foods that I need and find a way to do my exercise or whatever it is.
So it means that the person who has the most options has the most power. And so, and the reason they have the most power is because they have the most flexibility. And so survival really is about that flexibility in your life and having more than one game to play or card to draw upon or strength to, use in your life. And so the more diverse and the more rich we become in our inner world, the more powerful we're able to be in a positive way in our lives, I think.
Love it. So why did you decide to interview 500,000 people and how did you do this?
Might have been just a crazy idea. I mean, I'm very fortunate, very privileged in the sense that I get to run workshops on resilience all around the place, overseas as well as in Australia. And when you do that, of course, people do things for you, and which is kind of cool. And so what I started to do is to ask people to map their lives. And a really simple way of mapping your life, it wasn't very complicated, but it was to grab a bit of paper and, put a vertical axis of 10's the happiest you've ever been and 0's the most miserable you've ever been, and then track the years along the horizontal and then start to look at the ups and downs of life. And so I started to do that, and then I'd take these back to wherever I was staying that night and go through them and try to, consolidate the patterns. And I'll talk about those patterns a bit later. But the process then became one of then starting to use that general knowledge once I'd got about 20,000 or so, to then have people discuss how their lives varied from that. Of course, everyone has different experiences in their lives at different
Hmm.
times, but there are also, you used the word patterns early on, which surprised me that there was much more patterning to it than I had thought. And so starting to
Hmm.
understand those patterns gives you a chance to peek around the corner in life and go, what might be coming up for me and what might I need to prepare for differently? So, one of the mistakes that I think
Hmm.
commonly people make is to assume that life will always be the way it is now. And that's not true. Life will be
Hmm.
different because we are different and we grow and we develop and our circumstances change. And so, being able to look around the corner, maybe not exactly at what's going to happen for you personally, but what generally happens to people, is a very valuable gift, I think.
Hmm. That's so interesting. So, you talked about some of the patterns. Tell us a little bit about what are some of the common things you saw. I mean, these are all different types of people, different backgrounds, different races.
Yes, from all sorts of backgrounds. So, a really diverse bunch of people came to these things. Obviously, their common uh, aspect was that they were interested in thinking about their lives to some extent. So they were thoughtful enough to do that. But they were from many, many cultures and many religions, and a great diversity of people and a great diversity of ages. So, as part of it, for example, I held a series of lunches with people who are all in their 90s. And that was a
Mm.
fascinating process to do. Brothers and sisters, particularly, all in their 90s. And one of the things that I learned from those lunches, it was a great thing to do. One of the things I learned from those lunches was, if you ever have the belief, the idea that one day your brothers or sisters will see your upbringing precisely the way that you do, forget it. It's never going to happen. These people, brothers and sisters, were still arguing about the same old stuff 90 years later. Had never got to any reconciliation. In fact, in some ways, the divisions were stronger than ever
That's
and still
hilarious.
going hot. It was great.
That is hilarious. That is hilarious. So, what are the major life stages and what are some things that we can look out for? Like, let's say starting in your 30s. A lot of my listeners are like 30 plus.
Yeah, so really fascinating processes. Let's just go slightly before 30 and talk about 27 and a half, which now now these are going to sound slightly odd. And the reason,
Hmm.
I want to give a little bit of background. I didn't start out with any particular pattern in my mind, but as I reviewed thousands of these life charts, I became aware that it looked roughly, and it was rough. It's not a precise thing, but about every 7 years, people often had an experience of change, and so it was interestingly worthwhile to consider life in 7 year slices. And
Huh.
yeah, and so then, of course, having kind of come across this, I then, of course, realised that almost every culture and civilization and religion had come up with something similar along the idea of a 7 year cycle of life. So it became a really fascinating process. And so just before the 30s, there's a pattern around 27 and a half, and it was so precise in so many people's lives that it became quite. I really had to scratch my head and check out whether this was true. But there is a group of people who they have the first great love, and they really have this wonderful first relationship, and then after hanging together for quite some time, around 27 and a half, it all falls apart, and they're
Oh
devastated.
no.
They're set back on their heels, and they've just had this incredible shock. For some of them, if they're very privileged, it's the first real shock of their lives. And many of them, not all, but many of them, would then go back home to their village or their parents' home, and they would say, "Take me in, look after me." And of course, parents, being generally kind people, would do that and help the brokenhearted to kind of recover. But one of the things that I got to see was that if they stayed a bit too long, they often wouldn't leave again until they were 35. They would take quite
Hmm.
some time to repair and recover. So I guess one of the bits of advice that I started to say to parents of 20 something, 27 and something year olds was, if your child comes home brokenhearted after a dreadful relationship breakup, take them in, look after them, of course, be kindly, but boot them out fairly soon afterwards. Don't let them stay too long.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
yeah, so the 27th year, sorry, the 29th year, I should say, begins really with the commencement of adulthood. So many people dawdle and meander their way through life in a lovely kind of wayward way, although increasingly the 20s are a time of quite fraught confusion for many young people. They think they should know what they're doing and they've got no real idea. And it's only when they're 29th year that they start to get a bit of a handle on what's going on. And so they resolve this sort of time of kind of being pretty bewildered by suddenly latching on to something that they're certain of. And what was interesting for me was that they latched onto it with such ferocity that they became almost maniacal about it. So I ended up calling the phase 29 to 35 the Napoleon years. Now, the Napoleon years, because basically you think you've got a plan and you think it'll come off. It's going to be okay. But just as Napoleon discovered when he tried to attack Moscow, it doesn't always work out the way you hope. And so essentially, this is kind of really interesting. They can take on the world. They're full of all sorts of possibilities, but they're not flexible. They've got one game, and almost
Um,
invariably it runs out.
hmm. Hmm.
And so things then shift around 36. So between 36 and 42 is a very different phase of life to 29 to 35. Now, the 36 to 42 age range is filled with endeavor and energy still. So it's lots of possibilities. So people take on careers, they start things, they run podcasts, they do all sorts of wonderful things, right? And they can become so consumed with their own life. It's almost as if they treat their friends as walk on extras in their life. And so
Hmm.
friendships sometimes fall apart around this time. Certainly,
Huh.
there's a yeah. So cherished friends can basically fall out in sometimes dramatic ways around that 35 to 42 time. It's a time when everything looks good biologically, where everything's in the right place still, and but there's something different about this stage, and there's almost a. I ended up calling it clinging to the wreckage, which sounds a bit bleak, but it was actually a time when you're looking at the last sort of remnants of that real youth, and you'll try to work out basically how to kind of balance your new kind of you broadened out your endeavour. So you're no longer Napoleon with one single aim of conquering Moscow. You've got past that, but you've
Right.
now got this kind of great vision of what you can do. So you start families, you have renovations, you have children, you kind of start careers. You're nodding your head as I speak about this, and so it's a really interesting process. And conversations, of course, between people in that age range change quite dramatically from the idealistic nature of earlier conversations to a much more pragmatic of paying the bills and getting ahead and being the professional. And frankly, they're a bit boring, to be honest. But anyway, it's an interesting kind of process. I've just offended half your audience. I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so 42 to 49 is this incredible phase of life. And part of the reason, I think, is partly how it ends. Now, more people enter therapy at the age of
Mm.
49 than any other. And they do so
Huh.
because they lose themselves.
Why is that?
Well, between 42 and 49 is possibly the most industrious phase of life. People are incredibly busy, generally speaking. Sometimes they're raising children, often they're tending to careers, sometimes they're caring for aging parents. So they're sort of sandwiched in and they're so busy. They still do quite a lot of growing. I think during this phase, generally speaking, women grow more than men. So often by 49, the women look at the men and go, well, I've done all this development. What about you? So sometimes relationships become imperiled at that point. But generally, by the age of 49, you've been so preoccupied, you look in the mirror one day and go, where did I go? What happened to me?
Huh.
Where's my
Huh.
life gone? And it's this shock, really. And it's a time then of almost taking stock of your life. And if you don't take stock of your life, you can pretend that it's not happening, but that happens at a cost. So some men try to ignore this and remain strong and think that they are immortal and have a sort of Peter Pan type of ageless sort of belief that, they're just as strong as they were when they're 28 and everything sort of looks the same as it always was and they're just as sexy and desirable and wonderful as they always were. But, the look and the reality are not quite the same thing, So everybody else is looking at them and going, "You're not fooling anyone, mate." But but which is a tragedy for them. But anyway, that's okay. So, but it is an important time to reconsider your life because this is the peak time in many parts of the world for cardiovascular problems in men. In the next 7 year cycle, we see it for women. So that's slightly later for women. And so, unless you start to take care of yourself and to realize things aren't exactly the same as they've always been, you don't
Mm.
recalibrate. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and so I ended up calling this stage of life the holding the tiger by the tail phase. It's almost like you've got this tiger and you've got it by its tail, and if you let go of the tail, it's going to bite you big time, right? And so you've got
Right.
this. You got to hang on for grim kind of, basically for all you're worth, because otherwise you're going to basically fall apart. And there's often a time of sacrifice. So it's a time when people, in the best of ways, sacrifice themselves for their family, for loved ones, for relationships, and so, or for careers. And so it's a time then of exhaustion. And the answer to
Mm.
exhaustion, as the poet David White beautifully put it, the answer to exhaustion is not always basically more holidays. It's actually finding something that really is matters to your heart, something that's worthwhile. And so there's a
Mm.
calling to a real important purpose, a different purpose in your life.
Super cool. Would you say that this is one of the most difficult life stages, or is there one that's more difficult than this one?
Oh, yes. Sorry. Bad news coming. Just Ah, then you get the really difficult one. Oh no.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
so you're 49, you've looked in the mirror, you've
Yeah.
thought, where did my life go?
Where did I
And
go?
and suddenly you have to do a major readjustment. So between 49 and 56 is a phase of being betwixt and between, being all at sea, being bewildered. The old game plans no longer work. The old way of living your life no longer functions. Things have passed their use by date. And it's a time which is not always bad, but it's a time when almost invariably the angels and the demons both come out to play in your life. So it's a time of passion
Mm,
and ecstasy, of wanting to recapture things, and you watch people try and recapture things of their youth that they have lost. But it's also a
mm,
time when they're tormented because they're all grown up now. They should know what they're doing with their life, and most of them have got no idea. And so they go into this time of transition where they feel bewildered. Sometimes they think they're depressed, even though it's more an existential kind of malaise than a true depression. And they've lost their sense of purpose. They don't feel relevant anymore. Now, it's not always
hmm.
bad because people who've had rotten childhoods or have had really tough times in their late teens and early 20s, oftentimes at this stage of life between 49 and 56 is a chance to revisit some of those times and almost redo them properly. Well, so, but even if they're doing that, they're still going through this bewilderment phase. Now, some people, of course, during that time between 49 and 56 are parenting teenagers. And one of the fascinating things
Mm,
to watch is teenagers is trying to work out who you are, right? You're trying to work out how to be cool, how to fit in, how to be successful, how to be smart, dumb, whatever it is, right? That's what teenagership's all about.
yeah.
But the problem is that people between 49 and 56 are doing the same thing. They're going through exactly the same process
Huh.
of trying now. Their first half of their life is sort of finished, and they're trying to work out what am I going to do with the next part, right? And so you've got these two groups of age groups that are basically pretty much doing the same stuff. But the problem is the people who are 49 to 56, it's really easy for them to look at the people in their teenagerships and go, well, it's all right for you, and get a bit scathing and a bit, belittling of them because essentially, well, it's so easy for them, they've got computer games and blah, 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 and get a bit grumpy about it. And if you just do that, you're in trouble. So
Right.
one of the common errors at this stage of life is because in order to reinvent your life, which you have to do at various points throughout your life, but particularly at this point, the temptation for human beings, I think, is to feel discomforted in themselves, to look out across the room at somebody else and go, it's your fault, you're the reason. And so friendships, relationships fall apart because in some
Mm,
ways the other person is blamed for the disquiet in yourself. And while
mm,
obviously some relationships do fall apart, the way out of this phase is in. You've actually got to restructure who you are. You can't just blame your friends, your partners, because they don't have the answers either. So it's about reinventing who you are. Now, of course, historically speaking, many of our ancestors weren't alive for this long. So, in a way, the next part of life is less scripted historically because human beings haven't been at it for quite so long. They haven't lived as long. And so there is more diversity
right.
around it. And that's a great opportunity, of course, as well. So young people, oh, sorry, people today have more choices than their parents and way more choices than their grandparents and incredibly more diversity, thank goodness, than their great grandparents and so
Yeah.
on. Yeah. And so
I
here's a
find it so
freedom.
fascinating.
Sorry, go.
No, I find that really fascinating because, like, I think about like my grandmothers lived to 100. One of them lived to 99 or something. The other one was 103.
Yeah.
And so it's like, what would you do from 70 to 100? I mean, that's like 30 full years to do whatever.
And the answer is probably have a wonderful time. You see,
Yeah.
lots of people, we can go forward into that phase, but often, so the answer to this earlier phase of reinvention is connection and creativity. And so the people, it's a really interesting phenomenon when you get to that phase of life. It's almost like a split pathway for humans. Some people prematurely decide to become old
Mm-hmm.
and frail. They almost give up, whereas
Mm.
others open up the windows and doors of their life and allow fresh adventures, fresh relationships through passions, fresh interests into their world. And it's really amazing to me as I studied this that people who do that become really, they're like magnets to younger people. So their
Yes.
vitality is contagious. And you can see it in them. They're at the age that they are, but there's something really attractive about them, and there's something vibrant, and they're embracing life in a really creative way because they can afford to be much more innovative than when you're a scaredy cat teenager. You can't take those risks. Whereas in this later phase
Right.
of life, you can afford to you realize probably you're not going to look that good doing anything anyway. So you might as well just get on and do what you want, really. Um, and so being brave enough to do that makes a big difference. And so finding that area of
That's
creativity and connection makes a big, big difference.
that's super cool. I feel like I could talk to you about this forever. We might need to have you come back maybe after your book is out. What did you notice anything in the, let's say, people over 70 that were, I guess, more healthy, more vibrant, or just living a good life? Did you notice any consistencies between those people? That's what I'm mostly interested in.
Well, obviously, one of the things that we try to in that life, there's a dual kind of pathway. I think one is to use the benefits of modern medicine as much as possible. So that basically trying to think about while the picture of getting to those more senior years is a picture of decline, and biologically
Hmm.
sometimes people do decline in terms of levels of particular things. If you can keep those up, that makes a gigantic difference. And one of the ways to keep that up is by basically using what modern medicine can provide, but also living a life that is probably much more similar to our ancestors. So our ancestors would walk
Mm.
probably on average about 7 miles a day, for example. So moving the
Hmm.
body and moving the mind become incredibly powerful. And being prepared to give up some of the rivalries and the competitiveness of earlier years and to deepen relationships in a way. So probably because people of this age range who embrace vitality become magnets for younger people, they can afford then to take on proteges and partly help them to come into their own world in a really positive way. And the person who benefits from that is, well, both of them do.
I love that because I feel like I have a lot of people like that in my life. Like I have a lot of older friends.
It's a good thing to have, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great. It's really awesome. You benefit from the wisdom that they bring, and I think there's an energy exchange that happens. That's like you said, it's mutually beneficial.
And it's kind of handy to be around people who are, I don't know, 15, 20 years further down the road and can show you a bit of a way of doing it well. Because the popular media, at
Yeah.
least where I am, doesn't portray that very well at all. And so the
Yeah.
vibrancy,
No, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah. In Australia, where I am based, uh, the biggest users of online dating services are people over 60 years of age.
Oh, wow.
so, so many of them are becoming much more adventurous in terms of their relationships. So that's a kind of interesting thing to think about.
Super cool. Super cool. This is an awesome conversation. Can we do a part two? I want to do a part
Yeah, that'd be
two.
fantastic to do. Yeah.
Awesome.
So
So,
it's
where
just
can
trying
people
to get.
find your book? It's coming out really soon.
Yeah, it's coming out, I think, on the 7th of May. It's called Your Best Life at Any Age. And it's in Amazon and Barnes and Noble and places like that. And all good bookshops, I suppose I should say. And it's just about thinking about what the patterns of life are. And I'm not trying to say that the patterns will specifically apply to your life, because, of course, there are things
Mhm.
that happen in everyone's life which are just idiosyncratic. But to look at just the general patterns of life gives you a chance to go, well, what's true for me? So
Mm.
um, perhaps rather than trying to cover it right now, one of the things that would be great to talk about next time are family time
Yeah.
bombs and how they explode into people's lives, because they are
Mm.
incredibly powerful. So we could actually go through and track how you do up how you map your life and what you look for.
That sounds amazing. Let's do that.
Okay, let's do that. That sounds great. Okay.
Are you on social media?
I am. I'm on Facebook, uh, Andrew Fuller Psychologist, and I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm looking forward to part two.
I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. So it's been fantastic. Thank you so much.